So tonight, one of our more active contributors to the everyday functions of the Conservancy, Chris Drake, is going to be our speaker. Many of you know him, or at least have heard him. Chris has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology, a Master of Science in Marine Ecology, and he's been on Salt Springs since 2005. I think probably, Chris, you'll mention a little bit about your stewardship services. So I won't get into that. Right. Tonight, Chris is talking to us about how we can be better stewards for our land. So please enjoy. Over to you, Chris.
Super. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the show tonight. I'm just going to share my screen and get started here. Okay. So I sort of transpose the idea of environmental stewardship with the idea of small-scale ecosystem restoration. So I have a long-winded title here that will also serve as my outline. So small-scale ecosystem restoration through a combination of invasive plant control, planting of native species, wildlife habitat enhancement, and wildfire risk reduction. My business is called Coast Alive Stewardship Services. I have a website, so please check it out if you wish. And I'd really like to thank the Conservancy for inviting me. They do some really amazing work here on the island, and I'm really lucky to be working with them. I'd like to just perhaps expand a little bit on our recognition of the First Nations and talk a little bit about how they are the original stewards. And you can learn a lot about them through studying traditional ecological knowledge or ethnobotany. And I just want to show a couple of books that have some great information on how the First Nations used plants. This is the old classic, Plants of Coastal British Columbia, the Bible, but it's got some great stories. And this one's called Lusham's Plants, written by Dr. Lusham, Arvid Charley, and Nancy Turner. And it's a fantastic and really entertaining read. No. I'd also like to encourage you to think about where you live and whether you might be on an archaeological site, perhaps a midden or such things. And if you want to know more, you can request information from this website. This is a government website. And you could also find out about First Nations in this area from a couple of really cool movies by Harold Joe. I met Harold Joe working on a small streamside restoration project here on Salt Spring. It was going through a midden, and as it turned out, the midden was more extensive than we realized, so we had to call in an elder to help us in case we found some bones or something as we removed invasive plants and planted some native species. So it was fascinating to meet him. And this movie, Suhalem, it's about Chief Suhalem from what is now the Duncan area. And there's a mountain there, Mount Suhalem. And there's a fascinating history. So I really recommend you check both of these out to learn a little bit more. So quickly about me, I won't talk about myself here because of Gail. Thank you for your introduction. I came to Salt Spring in 2005 and started contracting, kind of beginning in ecological gardening, you could say, and some trail building. And then it just sort of morphed into this bigger umbrella of services called environmental stewardship. And I have a great pile of clients, work for a few conservancies and the Islands Trust and some of the stratas here on island and private landowners. There's a really active, interested community of people who are trying to do lots of stewardship and restoration work. So that's pretty great. And over my time, both in school and working on the land, I've developed a bit of a philosophy as to what I think is the most effective way of restoring small-scale restoration. So I'm talking about stuff you would do in your back, your back acre or two, or to help around a pond or some such thing. Often we get into much larger projects, and some of this philosophy isn't as applicable, but I find it's really important to just step lightly. Don't step on rotting logs, don't step on plants, really be aware of where you're putting your foot down. Take your time. It's not about killing off all of the unwanted plants. It's more about empowering the native plants. I believe in reducing the carbon emissions and footprint of my work, if I can. I've electrified my bike here. It's pretty wicked, and sometimes I can tow my tools in the trailer, and so that's a great way of getting to work. And I try and encourage local, eco-friendly materials, and I really try and avoid machines as much as possible. So that's one of the differences between larger scale restoration projects. I think it's important to, engage in advocacy and activism, and I'm on the board of this organization, Salt Spring Island Water Preservation Society. Shout out WPS. It's a fantastic group, and it's really effective. We've actually been part of all sorts of great projects. I won't get into it. I also do try and have a bit of fun along the way. We can't change the world on our own, but we can certainly do our best. And so all of this philosophy isn't merely because of me hanging around in the woods, talking to myself or some such thing. It's actually based on a couple of, two important sort of areas of research. And one is this idea that perhaps the best way to combat climate change and biodiversity loss is to plant the right native tree in the right place. It's one of the most powerful acts you could do. There's this wonderful researcher, Dr. Diana Beresford-Kruger, who has a number of articles in the Tyee, which is an online newspaper. And then, of course, there's Dr. Suzanne Simard, which probably many of you know, who's done some really amazing research on the interconnectedness under the ground through soil, fungal networks and such things. And so these trees are just hugely important in so many ways, whether it's carbon sequestration or providing habitat or food. And then the other idea is that even small patches of land can have really large results if they're restored well, because of the idea that biodiversity depends on spatial niches. And that's the idea that complexity creates, or niches, I'm not sure how I should be saying that, but regardless, this complexity creates a three-dimensional network that can be used by many creatures, especially insects. There's lots of researchers who have done great work in this area, and one of them is the late E.O. Wilson, one of our great ecologists, and he was especially interested in insects. So that's this sort of what drives me to try and develop this idea of the right sort of way to to concentrate on restoration or stewardship. I also find that you know, our society needs us, or we need, within our society, we need to be doing things like stewardship, because it's one of the greatest antidotes to environmental anxiety. I've had my first environmental science course in 1988 at UVic, and we studied our common future, the Brundtland Report, which was a seminal piece of work. They coined the term sustainable development, which is questionable in its own way. But regardless, from that moment onward, it's just been, you know, this barrage of bad news, and environmentalism can be just thankless and painful. And how do you deal with that? How do young people now deal with that? And I think for me, this idea of stewardship brings just amazing respite from all of that. Yeah, so you feel like you become connected and appreciated by the flora and fauna. So this is the last slide in my introduction here, because I think it's important to think about, when we think about where are we going to plant that tree, for instance, where is it going to be able to survive to maturity? You know, will it survive to maturity if we plant in parks and protected areas? And that's probably a good chance. There are parks that are 100 years old. If we plant these trees on private land, where's the best place to plant them so they might survive till maturity, 100, 200, 500 years? Sometimes I think, where should I plant on my land? Closer to the road, where it might not get developed? You know, if my land gets sold, somebody might tear down my house and expand the footprint or something. So these are sort of thoughts that aren't only philosophical, they're actually really practical. And I would encourage anyone who has a big enough piece of land and you can put a covenant on it. This is perhaps one of the best ways of long-term protection. And so it's, if you're blessed enough to actually be a steward of a piece of land, and you can covenant it, I really do really want to support that. It's a great thing to do. Okay. I just want to show a few tools. So hopefully I'm filling your screen and you can see things well. I can't view myself properly. Calvin, I'm wondering, oh no, you are muted. Here we go. Hey, Deborah, how does that look? Is that clear?
Yep, you look good. We can't see your head, but
that's okay.
see your
You just need to see the tools. Okay. So it's pretty basic stuff. Stewardship of this type just needs hand tools. So, you know, start out with your work belt. And you get some good quality sequitors. I think it's best to get the type where you can replace the blade, because they're really hard to sharpen well. A good saw, also with the replaceable blade. This is a Silky. And I think it's really important to be safe out there. I've always had good quality equipment. These are some wicked gloves. I like to use these ones for any spiky type plants like gorse or blackberry or holly. I definitely recommend glasses because there's a lot of spiky things. So a good quality locker for the bigger things like broom, and you can see it's a ratchet system sort of. That's probably the most powerful system. Sometimes you want to be chopping things down, so a really good set of shears. For instance, with blackberry, I like to do the chop and stomp if you don't have time to really remove them or anything. And for things like yellow flag iris or something that you've got to dig out root balls, this is a great tool. It's kind of like a mini mattock. If you do have to use a chainsaw, there's a lot of really great battery options now. These things have a lot of power, and you don't really need a much bigger blade than that, nearly. I mean, we're not going to do any logging out there. And a couple of planting shovels. This one is put in a lot of trees. And I hope it puts in a lot more. And then if you're putting in bigger ones, this is a great tool. And of course, removing invasive plants is only half of the battle. And for all of this work, you often also have to dispose of everything. So my favorite system is using a garbage can, because you can really stuff things in here, like really stuff, and then stomp on it, you know, and it becomes this really dense plug. And then when you take it to wherever you're disposing, it comes out and it just stays together in a really dense sort of way. It's easy to stack. And one little secret, probably know, I say avoid any type of plastic bag of any type if you can. We'll just get rid of these and I'm throwing them out. So this type of bag actually fits really nicely into the garbage can. And then you can stuff it, and then it comes right out like that. So if you do have to take things, you know, away to the disposal, like to Blackburn transfer station, you can take it, pile it in your car in this way, and then empty it there. So it's a really easy way of, you know, people are sometimes piling things into tarps and trying to hold it together, and I really find in the end, when it comes to this type of work, nothing beats a garbage can. Okay, so go out and get yourself some nice tools. And get busy. So share my screen again. So let's talk about invasive plant control. I want to mention if this is about control, this isn't about eradication. We're not trying to destroy all of the, or it's not about killing a bunch of plants we don't like. This is about controlling them so that our native plants can take back control, shall we say. And so this is an interesting, this is an interesting graph here. or chart, I guess, graphic, where they, Pryor et al. Did this sort of macro study of all of these different invasive plant or invasive species removal projects. And his question was, does invasive species removal lead to ecological recovery? And they only found half of the time was it positive. And then, a fifth of the time it was a negative. And so we find that controlling invasive species really is very specific to the site and the species. And it is best achieved through removal accompanied by replacement with competitive native species. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Just want to quickly show a book here. The New Wild: Why Invasive Species Will Be Nature's Salvation. And they've got some very good points here. If you're going to concentrate all of your invasive removal activities in areas where nothing else is growing, then you might actually be making things worse for the area. I want to say that carefully, but again, when you only have so much time, you only have so much money and energy, you really want to prioritize the areas that are most important. So when we're thinking about an invasive plant control program, first thing is you got to know your plants, both the native and the invasive ones. You got to know their strengths, you got to know their weaknesses. And, after removal for, days and weeks, you will know them very well. But you also want to prioritize where you put your energy. So think about working in the ecosystems of highest ecological value. So if you have the choice of working beside a road versus beside a stream, you choose the stream. Also try and work in areas where there's already a community of native plants present. So that will often be along the edge of a forest, say. So instead of in the middle of a big clear cut covered in broom, perhaps you would work along the edges. And that's the same idea beside natural areas. So we want to make bigger and larger and more robust areas that can resist re-encroachment. So as an example, we can talk later if you wish about individual species. I'm not going to get into those, except to talk, I'm going to talk here about yellow flag iris as an example. So yellow flag iris is quite an amazing plant. Its strengths are it's just a prolific grower. It just creates so much biomass, especially in pretty low oxygen conditions. And it creates this dense mat of rhizomes that are really very thick. And it's also got these waterproof floating seeds. So it's pretty good at spreading to other disturbed areas. So this is the before and after pictures of a little pond at Blackburn Lake Nature Reserve. And here along the side here, I've cut the fronds short, but this is all big floating mats of yellow flag iris. And it took some time. I got in there with, my hip waders and got it all out, all the rhizomes out. And sure enough, it did not come back very much. And instead, a whole bunch of sedges and cattails moved in really quickly. So it's a project that just takes a lot of grunt work, but it's successful. It's looking good. And we're finding piles of red-legged frog eggs in this particular pond. So that might be an indication that it's becoming of higher ecological value. And I'll talk a bit more about them later. But again, like I said before, you remove the plants, but you got to do something with them. And I'm a real fan of keeping all the biomass on site. You know, not only is it just a lot less work, which means you can spend your time removing the plants and doing things as opposed to carrying the biomass all over the place. You don't spread the seeds the same way, or the, you know, whatever. And also then the nutrients stay on site, and you actually create some complexity that helps with wildlife habitat enhancement. So what we've found is the best thing to do is to locate large piles, the fewer and larger, and you put them under things like deciduous trees. So it's exposed in the winter and shaded in the summer. So this pile is probably 20 dense garbage cans full of broom that I was jumping on top of and stomping it right down. It was really, really dense, and you could see it's probably, well, it was taller than me in the end. If you're concerned about wildfire risk, you can cover it with leaves or soil, or even a heavy tarp in the summertime, and then you remove the tarp in the wintertime. But this is under it was a pretty big Gary oak, so it should get a lot of leaves and rot down. They really rot down pretty quickly. You kind of, the idea is to get it like spaghetti. So things like broom, for instance, they can be really spread out, and so you would cut each of the branches so it really packs together like spaghetti. So you really think about that as you're removing it. Yeah, it's often just a overlooked part of the whole removal process, is what do you do with the biomass. But it's once you figure out the system, it works pretty well to do it this way. And then the other thing is that we got to protect, plant and protect native species. Because of deer, deer really at this stage on the Gulf Islands anyhow, they control our plant community to a large degree. There's resident deer in nearly every location I work. They're there all the time. Deer are very good at what they do, which is eat fresh growth. They find it and they nibble it. So we end up with the situation where I was working, for instance, in this one lovely old growth patch, nearly old growth, Ruby Alton Nature Reserve down on Isabella Point Road. And it's got some gorgeous veteran fir trees in there and massive maples and nice big openings as well. And there's not a single young tree, not one. And it just makes me think of like a village without children. So that's something as stewards we need to take very seriously, which means we've got to plant and protect these plants. So how do we plant? So I'm going to give a quick little, I think I've got 5 steps to planting successfully so that your plants survive without being watered. On a lot of our restoration sites, you're not getting up there until, well, you're never getting up to water. So they've got to do well. And first of all, choosing your species and your microsite. Well, let the forest decide what species you choose. Look around and plant what is there in similar conditions. We're not landscaping here. This isn't really about what you want to see. You know, that being said, we also do need to think about reintroducing species that have been removed from the ecosystem. But at this stage, let the forest decide, and then choose your microsite really carefully. You want to think about shade and moisture retention. So in this situation, this is inside an exclosure, and this is south, so that's where the sun is, and so this is quite tall salal, and it'll shade and protect this area that I'm planting in. Not necessarily the top of the plant, but it'll shade down where at the roots, which is the most important thing. You can choose to be beside logs, choose depressions, but put a lot of thought into your microsite. And then what I like to do is I remove the sod layer or the top layer if you need to. It depends on your site. And I put that into a little pot, and you want to be really careful that you don't disturb around the hole. Keep it really clean. The upper layer of soil is the most biologically active. This is where all of the community of bacteria and fungus, they're largely in that top 5 to maybe 15%, 15 centimeters of the surface. So be really careful not to disturb that surrounding area. And then what I do is I dig a deep but not wide hole, and about twice the depth, or 1.5 times at least the depth of the pot. And that's because we want the roots to go down right away. We don't want them to go to the side where the soil will dry out more. We want them to go straight down and get as deep as possible, as quickly as possible. And then what I do in the bottom of the hole, I put back that sod, and you grab other types of organic material. I got some leaves here. You can grab rotted wood, even just mulch. It depends where you're working. If you're at home, you might have those sort of things. I usually just grab what's close by, and you don't have to bring stuff in necessarily. And then I also put a bit of granular organic fertilizer, and I mix it in really well, with the shovel. Just mix it up really nicely. And then you put your plant in there, just level with the ground, and any rocks that got removed, you put them on top, because they're one of the best ways of protecting the soil as a rock. And it also provides enhanced microsite. And then probably most importantly, you mulch very heavily. This is some really thick maple leaves that I just found nearby. Sometimes I would grab bark. Nice thick bark is a wonderful mulch. Logs, rocks again. So anything that protects the soil from the elements and suppresses competition. We're not really worried about nutrients here. Native soils aren't very nutrient rich, and so most of our native species didn't evolve needing lots of nitrogen and such things. And I found on a number of sites, like hot Gary Oak sites, 90–95% survival of my planted species without any watering. So I think this is a really good system. And one other thing I like to say is that choose plants that are really robust, at least in 1 gallon pots, or 2 gallon. You want something that's, in a lot of other restoration jobs, we've done large amounts of smaller plants, and I find they just can't compete, they can't survive. So you want really healthy, robust plants in this work. Great, so we have planted. Where do we get our plants? Well, I'm a big fan of everyone having a nice little backyard nursery. It's amazing what you can scrounge from just weeding and such things. There's lots of plants that you can grab in ditches and power lines. Maybe that's a bit rebellious, but I figure if a tree is not going to achieve maturity because it's in a ditch, then it should be fair pickings. And then there's a whole idea of doing lots of cuttings and seeding. here down in this area, I've got a bunch of cuttings. I think those were willows, perhaps. A lot of our shrubs and some of our deciduous trees are really easy to do cuttings. And the Conservancy is going to have a cutting workshop coming up that I'm going to be part of. So keep your eyes open for that if you're interested in knowing more. And then I just like to really pile the pots all close together so it makes it easy to water. And like I said before, you want to grow these maybe a couple of years before you plant them, so they're really solid and robust and nice roots on them. And then finally, you have to protect all of these lovely plants. And I'm not going to get into this. A lot of people have aesthetic concerns with fencing, and you have to get over that. We have to fence these plants until they're well above browse height. So when you're doing your restoration work, think about how large you want to do it. This is a project. Well, this upper one is a Garry Oak demonstration ecosystem at Blackburn Lake Nature Reserve, and it's got a wonderful pile of Garry Oaks and associated species. And it's quite a large, and it's expanding every year, so that's great. This is a smaller one that was maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, and it was a little bit more experimental. We were trying to find ways to combat reed canary grass, which grows down in these lower areas. And this one over here on the right is a smaller, maybe two foot diameter exclosure, and it's got a maple and a red flowering currant in it, and they're just loving life. And actually, I think this one has been removed because they're big enough, and that's the thing, you remove them and you use them on the next plant. So think about how long it's going to be in place. The longer the better. And I would really, really like to promote the idea of permanent nature zones. Have a corner of your land and say, this isn't for people, this isn't for the animal, for the cat or the dog to go in, fence it, maybe make a nice fence. And that's going to be, the nature zone. That's where the deer, or maybe not the deer actually, but the birds and the mammals, the small mammals and insects and everything will be, and you can just enjoy it from the outside. Not every inch of our land that we could call private property necessarily should belong to us. Okay, I hope my time is all right here. This is the part of my work I love the most, wildlife habitat enhancement. It's just so satisfying because it's, like I said before, that idea of creating spatial complexity. When you create a situation where there's food, there's water, there's shelter, there's predator protection, then you'll really find a remarkable amount of creatures will recognize that this is a place that they can survive. And so that in that way, small areas, a corner of your land can really have large results. I just want to talk about a couple of success stories when it comes to wildlife habitat enhancement. This one's to do with the northern red-legged frog, which is a species of special concern, blue listed here in BC. And it's threatened by, like most things, loss of habitat, introduced species, such as bullfrogs and fish. And there's probably other factors as well. So I've been hired by the Conservancy to go around all the lakes on Salt Spring Island for quite a number of years now, and basically I GPS every egg mass. So a single female will lay a single egg mass, And they can be quite large. They're like, baseball size, perhaps. They're sometimes just at the surface of the water, but sometimes up to even, 2 feet below the surface, and they'll be attached to a reed or a piece of, woody debris or something. And since Blackburn Lake is engaged in a whole pile of wetland construction and restoration, they've been getting higher and higher populations in Blackburn Lake and the ponds on islands, or on the reserve. So I think that shows just you can never quite directly connect one activity with the other, but these consistently high populations of this frog is a pretty good indication that the wetland restoration is helping. And just down here is my helpful assistant when I'm lucky enough to get my daughter to come with me. It doesn't happen quite so much anymore, but that's a great fun. And there's also some wonderful beaver work happening. So I want to show you a video. We put up cameras all over the Blackburn Lake Nature Reserve to try and get some good idea of how many beavers are coming in. And for those who don't know, beavers are really great ecosystem engineers, shall we say. They really alter an area that brings benefit to biodiversity, as well as all sorts of other water-related functions, such as filtering and storage of water. So they're really special creatures to have on the landscape. And we got some great footage. So I'll just show this. And they're very, very active little things. I'm going to show one other video just because I love it so much. But that beaver probably did that 10 times per night, hauling out a branch that size. It was quite incredible. Okay, maybe not the most exciting video, but yeah. So and heron are also species of special concern. So it's great that they're also coming onto the wetland. So one of the most important things about wildlife habitat enhancement is creating food for creatures. And I'd like you to consider it's as much about growing bugs as it is about growing vegetation. And when you are growing bugs, think about all of the life stages that they have, and try and create a complex environment that can provide the substrate or what they need. Shrubbery is really great to create a habitat for bugs, as is woody debris like piled sticks like here. Yeah, you know, we've got an incredible variety of bats. For instance, on Salt Spring Island, every single one is an insectivore. You know, when you think about our amphibians, when you think about our lizards, nearly everything's an insectivore, at least part of their life. So creating that complexity for bugs is really vital to create, you know, those food chains for biodiversity. You also want water any chance you can to, you know, build a pond or some such thing. I really recommend that. Water will bring in so many creatures. This is a small pond that I have built in our backyard, and because we have a lovely cat, I've created this, you know, protection from the cat. And very often the cat will be outside hanging out, maybe not too pleased, and on the inside there'll be a pile of birds doing their thing, getting some water and cleaning up. And yeah, it's quite something to see. So ponds, and a variety of ponds is actually really special too, because they seem to sort of stratify into groups, where some birds will go to one and some to another. And so get that water there, and if you can have creatures around, you know, and even if you don't have a cat, if you live in, you know, a semi-urban area like much of Salt Spring, you should assume that you've got cats on your land. They're everywhere, and whether they're feral or getting out of a house, they're just part of the landscape. We know how they affect, you know, wildlife. So yeah, this is Martha. She is part of the family. I'm not in control of it. So we have a cat, but we've done what we can to protect these little airy patches of land from the cats, and they really are used a lot by wildlife. So you get the water, you get the protection, and then you can also build shelters, bird and bat shelters. These ones are maternity bat boxes. So they're really. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Okay, I will continue. Okay, so that's part of the BC Bat program, and we've got a whole bunch of these up all around the island, and they're quite complex, but you can find designs for these on the Salt Spring Island Conservancy website. And down here, these are part of the Western Screech Owl Bat bird restoration program. I'm not sure of its official title, but regardless, these are for Western Screech Owls. And what you'll find is that different species of birds will have different requirements for their boxes, and generally it's about the size of the opening and the size of the box. And I'm just going to quickly show you, if you do have bird and bat boxes, there's a few things to think about. So this is a swallow box that I built a number of years ago just from recycled wood. The paint is only on the outside. I wouldn't put paint on the inside if I could help it. And this specific shape is what I read in the literature about what swallows need. The other things that you need to have in your bird box or your bird house, you want to have some access, because you have to clean them every year. This is an active duty. It needs to have some aeration on the sides, as well as aeration on the bottom. So those are the things. You don't need to have cute little driftwood attached. In fact, that's probably a negative thing. Simplicity, nice and solid. This is a bit of a small lid, or small roof, I should say. But this is a swallow box, so it actually goes into the underhang of our roof, so it doesn't get so wet. And like I say, you need to clean them out every year, and the birds will be coming back soon. So if you have boxes, you're going to need to get out there pretty soon to go and clean them out and get the spider webs out and the old nests, and make them all ready for whoever's coming home. And finally, I'm not going to speak too much about wildfire risk reduction, but this is a pretty important part of our ecosystem, and it's something that as stewards, we want to take seriously on Salt Spring. It can get pretty darn dry here. And wildfire does play an important role in coastal forest ecosystems. A lot of First Nations used fire to keep the land in a certain condition and create, around here was Gary oak meadows, so they would set fires that would kill the smaller fir trees and the smaller shrubs, and then the larger Gary oaks would survive, and there would be a lot of camas and other plants that they use a lot. So it was pretty well-developed form of agriculture in a way. And then if we suppress wildfire, then it leads to a buildup of fuels, and that increases the risk. So this is something you want to take seriously on your land. I do want to point out, though, that in much of the wet coastal forest, what we call the maritime coastal forest, the fire interval could be well over 500 years, which means that virtually the entire coast, except for these Gary oak meadows, would have been huge trees and just a highly developed old growth. It's all gone. But this idea of in the interior, fire is much more common than on the coast, or has a much stronger impact on the forest than on the coast. That being said, on Salt Spring, we're in this very dry area, and so that's a little bit different, and we do need to do this type of work. So the idea of reducing your risk of wildfire is to bring the fuel to the forest floor. You want it decomposed, but also when you bring it into the contact with the forest floor, your carbon, your water, and your nutrient sequestration will increase, which brings resiliency and to the forest. And it also brings more light to the forest floor, which brings a lusher growth. So it's a great stewardship activity to do. And the reason we're doing it is because of these three areas of wildfire risk. We want to try and control ignition, we want to control spread, and we want to control intensity. So when you think about where do wildfires ignite, well, in this part of the world, it's where people are. We have very few natural caused fires in this part of the world. Whether it's work sites are a very common source of wildfire ignition. The one on Galliano was from a work site burning stuff. You want to think about tall grasses. They can ignite really easily at certain times of the year. So keep those tall grasses down along the road. And also think about these areas where there'll be leaves and twigs that sort of pile up in deposition areas that, say in the ditch below a large fir or something, you'll get a buildup of, cones and twigs. And so those are areas that you want to try and clean up. Then when it's about spread, you want it to stop. If it does start, you want it to not go anywhere. And so that means you want to control the layer of fuel and make sure it's not a continuous layer of fuel, and try and create fire breaks between homes and clear along the roads. And when it comes to intensity, you know, if a fire is coming through and it's in the crown of the tree, then we're all just running. There's, you know, it's already way too intense. We want to stop that from happening. So that's when, if you have larger suspended woody debris, you know, trees that aren't in contact with the ground, you want to try and get that in contact with the ground. And you want to remove these things called ladder fuels, which are the dead branches that are lower down on the trees, you know, up to say 2 meters, because those are a ladder for a ground fire to reach the crown. So those are some important parts of our wildfire risk reduction. This idea is in many ways similar, but also slightly different from what is promoted by, say, the BC Ministry of Forests or our local fire chief. They have this idea of fire smart, where you have these sort of zones, and then in priority zone 1, you basically have barely anything that can burn, and then it becomes well, in each zone you really try and remove a lot of fuel, and as opposed to trying to promote decomposition of the fuel. So anything that has mushrooms or conchs on it, moss or lichen, that's good stuff. You leave that there. That's on its way to becoming like something that actually retains moisture. So most important, again, things are in contact with the soil. Now, in some situations, there's just a huge amount. So this is one of my clients, and it was a really dry and sort of dense forest with a lot of down trees. So what I did is I, first of all, created this, again, this really dense pile with this spaghetti kind of concept of having all of the branches aligned, and so all of the smaller debris went below, and then the larger debris went as a cap on the top. And then you make sure there's no continuous layer around, layer of fuel around it. And the thing about this is, not only is it, well, to try and chip all of this would have taken me 4 times as long for sure to carry it all out, to get it chipped or something like that. So this is an idea that I've developed with a number of biologists, and it's just the best idea we've come up with. You place, and then what we've also done in this situation is we've planted fast-growing trees and shrubs around it, so that will shade it and drop leaves on it. But the thing is, this also creates wildlife habitat. It's a great little spot for all sorts of creatures to live. So that's another part to think about. You want to, all of these ideas, invasive plant control and wildlife habitat enhancement, wildfire risk reduction, they all work together to create just a more healthy and resilient landscape that sequesters water, sequesters carbon, and leads to higher biodiversity. So it's just a marvelous way to slowly but surely make a pretty significant difference, I think. You know. This is my last slide here. And because I really think it's important to promote this idea of stewardship, not just as something that volunteers do when they've finished working, retire or something, or it's not just, you know, kind of put at the back burner and you do it if you have a bit of extra money. This is something that is, in a way, it's the ultimate green job. stewardship, restoration is one of the greatest things we can be doing. And I think what we need is a bit of a shift, a paradigm shift in how we approach landscaping and gardening. This idea that we only choose species that we like, as opposed to species that, are important for all the other creatures around us. And so for those who have money and land, and if you do have those things, you're a lucky person, but you also have a responsibility, I believe, to have a stewardship budget and to take this idea seriously, to hire perhaps groups of young people who are, have really good knowledge, and instead of making them go out tree planting, on the clear cuts, putting in a monoculture, give them work creating a forest. So yeah, I think this is a really important aspect to think about, because we really need to harness all the energy we can to deal with some of the environmental problems coming at us, and stewardship is a really important way to get stuff done that way. So I think that's quite enough for me. Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in, and again, thank you to the Conservancy for having me. You do great work.
Chris, thank you. That was wonderfully
There we
informative.
go.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I do have there's a few questions in the chat for you.
Oh, great. Okay.
First, can you dispose of non-flowering invasives in berms?
I certainly would. The concept of a berm, I guess, is that you've got multiple layers of woody and organic material. I think that if you have invasive plants at the bottom of the berm and it's covered up by stuff, then that's great. You're always going to have to monitor to some degree, but even if you get one or two plants that manage to squeeze their way out, I think that's a great idea. And on that site where I was doing that wildfire risk reduction in those piles, we were putting Daphne, a lot of Daphne in the inside of those piles. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. We also did, for those of you watching, we had a berm workshop in November, and from that we are creating a brochure. So hopefully soon in the next few months we'll have that ready for release on our website. So second question, Chris. You recommended digging 1.5 times the depth of your pot. 2-gallon pots are quite deep, soil can be quite shallow. How do you balance these requirements?
Well, if you can't keep going down, then you can't keep going down, I guess. It's just a sort of guideline. If you can get a bunch of organic material into the bottom of the hole, I mean, that's what you're trying to do. If you can only get a layer of organic material down there, then that's fine. Often, if the soil is quite shallow because of bedrock, well, there's not much you can do. But often it's just hard, like not quite shale, but just really rocky. And sometimes it just takes a bit more work. But if you can, you do your best, but if you can't, then, I suppose perhaps what they're thinking about is that in that situation, maybe they should go wider. And that might be a good idea. If it's really, really shallow, then you could build it a bit wider. And, if you do everything else with that thick mulch and everything, it should probably be okay.
Okay, great, thank you. So another one, once you've planted a number of trees, how would you encourage understory? We've tried planting Solal and Oregon grape with not much success.
Yeah, neither have I had any success with transplanting Salal and Oregon grape. They just don't like that. And it's hard to know why. So both of those species are easiest, if you have a home-based nursery, then you can propagate them through seeds. Otherwise, I would recommend maybe buying 4-inch pods and of Salal and Oregon grape, and then putting them into larger pots for a year before you plant them. You know, if you've got your tree, it's so much as, again, it's site specific. So if you're dealing with an aggressive non-native grass, or you know, some other really aggressive non-native species, then after you've done your trees, you might just be going for larger shrubs. You know, the whole idea is that you need to change the soil conditions and the moisture and the light conditions in order to shade. Usually most of our invasive plants are shade lovers, are sun lovers, and so you need to shade them out. That being said, we've got a lot of holly around, and the holly is a different story. But then in those situations, other stuff grows easier because it's usually wetter conditions. So, so if you haven't had any luck transplanting, then try just doing it from the pods. There's one other thing you can do at this time of year. It's called live staking, and some shrubbery you can do that well, which is just you cut pieces of branches. I mean, it's more complex than that, but you cut pieces out of branches and you put them straight into the soil, and then they will root and develop leaves. Things like willow work really well that way. So yeah, I guess you got to try some other species.
Great, thank you. How can you identify a northern red-legged frog egg mass? What time of year would you expect to see them?
Okay, we'll be seeing them if it's really warm, maybe around the beginning of March. Otherwise, it depends mostly on water temperature. So it's somewhere usually between mid-March and mid-April. And they're very distinct. Our only other native frog is the, well, certainly common native frog is our chorus tree frog, and it has much smaller, like we're talking about the end of a thumb, if that size egg mass, whereas northern red-legged frog, there's nothing like them. They're these larger gelatinous groups that are, you know, baseball to softball size, so really distinct, and they are quite rare. So they need a deeper pond usually, so they won't be in more shallow ponds that dry up. So that's why we don't sample sort of ephemeral sort of wetlands for them so much as we do the deeper areas. Yeah.
Great, thank you. What do you think of assisted migration, planting species of trees further south of us, non-native, as we adapt to a warming climate?
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating conversation, and we chat about it a lot out there. Everyone's got an idea, and yeah, I guess I think we have enough native species at this stage that we can perhaps choose native species that might be on a drier site. For instance, at Blackburn Lake, it's a fairly moist area. There's a lot of cedar growing there, but we're planting that big Gary Oak area because of this idea of the warming climate. But we are still planting cedars as well, because even in a warmer climate, there'll be refugia where species will survive. And our native fauna is so has evolved with our native flora. So we plant cedar still in ravines and north-facing slopes and wetlands. I guess there's, you know, I want to encourage it, but there's so much research about invasive plants that this is a difficult question, because invasive plants lead to extinction, and we need to be very careful when we're introducing plants. For instance, people would be promoting eucalyptus because they're much hotter species, and they grow really well here, and it's, one thinks that perhaps if things change a little bit more, suddenly they'd be a species of concern. So it's really interesting to think about. I would say if you want to do something like planting species of non-native, native trees, maybe do it closer to where you can monitor them, and don't do too many of them. And you know, I don't think, we haven't discussed any of this in restoration work. We're still planting our native species only in restoration.
Thank you so much. So it looks like I've got one final question here. Are there any programs that supply free native plants locally? If not, maybe there will be grants available with recent federal biodiversity talks.
Yeah, I don't know any programs. I'm sorry. You know, it would be, they're so easy to grow that it would be lovely if we had just community hubs where people grew and gave away plants. But you know, the next best thing is to go and find yourself a ditch or a power line, and you know, or areas where you know that the plant won't achieve maturity. So maybe that's the next best thing. Okay.
Well, that's great, Chris. I think we'll get wrapped up right now. I really appreciated some of your reminders, especially earlier on, the reminder to go lightly. And I liked the idea of avoiding machines. And I noted that your very high-tech advice, really, for tools included mega gloves and a garbage can. So I think we can all come up with that.
Yeah.
I think that we're very lucky here on Salt Spring, and in particular at the Conservancy, to have your knowledge and experience and your dedication to this part of growing and living here. I really appreciate your presentation tonight, and look forward to more workshops with you. So thank you.